How does David's response to his son Absalom's rebellion and his endurance of wrongful cursing exemplify enduring faith and resilience amidst betrayal and suffering? As the narrative unfolds, explore the timeless lessons of patient endurance and the transformative power of faith, resonating with both biblical principles and the teachings of Jesus. It is so good to have you for our Bible study today, brothers and sisters. In the last lesson, we saw the consequences of David's past sins come to the forefront. Trouble brews as his family members follow his sinful path, leading to a reckoning from God. David's son, Absalom, a charismatic figure, strategically positions himself at a busy city gate, feigning concern for people seeking justice. He suggests that if he were in charge, justice would prevail, gaining the people's support. This political maneuvering mirrors tactics used by politicians today. Absalom fabricates a trip to Hebron, supposedly to fulfill a vow, but he uses it to garner support for his rebellion. David, unaware of Absalom's true intentions, grants permission. As the rebellion gains momentum, even David's counselor, Ahithophel, joins Absalom. David, realizing the seriousness, flees Jerusalem, not wanting to witness his beloved city's destruction, which he sees as God's judgment. David's loyal followers, like Ittai the Gittite, accompany him into exile, demonstrating unwavering loyalty. David sends the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem, recognizing God's role in his situation. David learns of Ahithophel's involvement and prays for God to thwart his counsel. Later, David's friend Hushai joined Absalom, acting as a spy to relay information through the priests. Let us sit prayerfully as we come to yet another episode.
Samuel chapter 16, verses 1 and 2. When David had gone a short distance beyond the summit, there was Ziba, the steward of Mephibosheth, waiting to meet him. He had a string of donkeys saddled and loaded with 200 loaves of bread, 100 cakes of raisins, 100 cakes of figs, and a skin of wine. The king asked Ziba, "Why have you brought these?" Ziba answered, "The donkeys are for the king's household to ride on. The bread and fruit are for the men to eat, and the wine is to refresh those who become exhausted in the desert." You recall that Mephibosheth was Jonathan's lame son. Because of David's great love for Jonathan, he cared for Mephibosheth. Verse 3. The king then asked, "Where is your master's grandson?" Ziba said to him, "He is staying in Jerusalem because he thinks, 'Today the house of Israel will give me back my grandfather's kingdom.'" Then the king said to Ziba, "All that belonged to Mephibosheth is now yours." "I humbly bow," Ziba said. "May I find favor in your eyes, my lord the king." Ziba, a servant of Mephibosheth, thought that the internal struggle within the house of David would enable him to make a fast buck. Ziba is a very practical man. Remember that David had left Jerusalem on foot, that too barefoot. And what does Ziba do? He provides donkeys, bread and fruit for the men to eat, and wine to refresh those who were exhausted. Then Ziba deceives David. Ziba hoped to get something out of the estate of Mephibosheth. David, not having the opportunity to check the facts, grants Ziba the land that had been Mephibosheth. The next few verses talk about a relative of Saul, Shimei. Until now, he wouldn't have dared oppose King David. Now that David is at a time of weakness and on the run from Jerusalem, Shimei takes the opportunity and curses David. Let's read verse 5. As King David approached Bahurim, a man from the clan of Saul's family came out from there. His name was Shimei, son of Gera, and he cursed as he came out. He pelted David and all the king's officials with stones, though all the troops and the special guard were on David's right and left. As he cursed, Shimei said, get out, you man of blood, you scoundrel. The Lord has repaid you for all the blood you shed in the household of Saul, in whose place you have reigned. The Lord has handed the kingdom over to your son Absalom. You have come to ruin because you are a man of blood. What Shimei said to David had some truth in it. David was a man of blood, and judgment was coming upon him. There was no question about that. While Ziba deceived David, Shimei opposes him directly. And that too, it happened during a time of David's weakness. A lesson for us. Be careful, dear friend. There are people who will deceive you by showering you with gifts. Don't fall for it. There may be others who would use the opportunity to curse or cast stones. You know, it's easier to tolerate someone who opposes you directly, who throws stones and calls you names. But it is difficult to identify Zebas. They can deceive and you can fall for it. We've got to watch out. Verse 9, Then Abishai, son of Zeruiah, said to the king, Why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over and cut off his head. Abishai, one of David's men, was all for silencing this man permanently. Notice David's reaction to what Shimei said. Verses 10 and 11. But the king said, What do you and I have in common, you sons of Zeruiah? If he is cursing because the Lord said to him, Curse David, who can ask, Why do you do this? David then said to Abishai and all his officials, My son, who is of my own flesh, is trying to take my life. How much more than this Benjamite? Leave him alone, let him curse, for the Lord has told him to. David was saying, I really don't mind this outsider cursing me. I do not want to take revenge on him. The thing that is happening to me is the judgment of God. What disturbs me is that my own son Absalom, is leading a rebellion against me. Now let's get back to Jerusalem with Hushai as he offers his services to Absalom. If you remember, Hushai remained loyal to David. He is now approaching Absalom as a spy. Verse 15. Meanwhile, Absalom and all the men of Israel came to Jerusalem, and Ahithophel was with him. Then Hushai the Archite, David's friend, went to Absalom and said to him, Long live the king, long live the king. Absalom asked Hushai, Is this the love you show your friend? Why didn't you go with your friend? Absalom is surprised that this trusted friend of his father's did not go with him into exile. Verse 18 and 19. Hushai said to Absalom, No, the one chosen by the Lord, by these people, and by all the men of Israel, his I will be, and I will remain with him. Furthermore, whom should I serve? Should I not serve the Son, just as I served your father? So I will serve you. Hushai is saying that the man whom God and the people chose will be his man, although he is secretly planning to spy for David. Let's leave Hushai for the moment and now take a closer look at Ahithophel. Verse 20. Absalom said to Ahithophel, Give us your advice. What should we do? Ahithophel answered, Lie with your father's concubines, whom he left to take care of the palace. Then all Israel will hear that you have made yourself a stench in your father's nostrils, and the hands of everyone with you will be strengthened. So they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof, and he lay with his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. Ahithophel advises Absalom to do an abominable thing, but it has great significance for Israel. Absalom's act was a coarse and rude declaration that David's rights had ended and that everything he owned now belonged to his son. Remember, it was on the same roof that David cultivated the seeds of lust when he saw Bathsheba. It was also possibly Ahithophel's way of avenging David for defiling his granddaughter Bathsheba. Now, how do I get this information? Listen to these two verses, 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 3. And David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, "Isn't this Bathsheba the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" Now another verse, 2 Samuel chapter 23, verse 34. Eliphalet, son of Ahasbai the Maachathite, Eliam, son of Ahithophel the Gilonite. Now, Eliam was the father of Bathsheba. He was mentioned on David's honor roll of brave men in chapter 23. And his father was Ahithophel, David's chief advisor. And Uriah was Bathsheba's husband. And he too, Uriah, was mentioned in the honor roll of David's courageous men. David's sin against Bathsheba is all the more wicked when you realize the people he had offended, the ones closest to him. Ahithophel, David's chief advisor. Eliam, Uriah were David's trusted men who protected him. Imagine the betrayal these men would have felt when they discovered their king, the one they looked up to, the one they sacrificed their time and life, now betraying them. David used his influence and power to commit this wicked act, and these men may have been forced to be silent, helpless spectators to this sin. Now you can understand why Ahithophel would have seized the opportunity with Absalom to retaliate against David. Verse 23. Now in those days the advice of Ahithophel gave was like that of one who inquires of God. That was how both David and Absalom regarded all of Ahithophel's advice. The word of Ahithophel was obeyed without question, just as if it had been the command of God. David knew that. The act of Absalom fulfilled what the Lord had spoken to David. 2 Samuel chapter 12, verses 11 to 12. This is what the Lord says, "Out of your own household I am going to bring calamity upon you. Before your very eyes I will take your wives and give them to one who is close to you, and he will lie with your wives in broad daylight. You did it in secret, but I will do this thing in broad daylight before all Israel." We now find David back in the dens and caves of the earth. What is he going to do? Absalom is going to try to win the victory over David's forces. David, however, is an old veteran and knows how to fight. Absalom is actually doing a very dangerous thing by going against his father. The tragic thing is that David loves him and wants to save him. These were difficult days for David. I'm sure by now that your heart goes out in sympathy to him. But David does not whimper or cry aloud. He says in substance, "Just as long as I know that things are right with God, I will bear these burdens that come upon me." David was a great man, friend. He had committed an awful sin. It's like a piece of art with one flaw in it. Isn't this the way many of us are? Did you ever meet one who didn't have a flaw? We all have flaws in our lives. Thank God that He will not throw us overboard because of the flaws. Let's read on. Let's proceed to chapter 17. Absalom hears the counsel of Ahithophel and Hushai, David's friend. When Absalom accepts Hushai's argument that David and his men are veterans in the field of battle and that Absalom needs reinforcements, David is able to escape and prepare for battle. As we have been following the different experiences of David, we saw first his triumphs and now we are seeing his troubles. In fact, he is really in trouble right now. David's own son Absalom is leading a rebellion against him. This was a heartbreak to the king. David withdrew from Jerusalem because he did not want it to become a scene of battle and possibly be destroyed. Instead, David left his beloved city. However, he sent Hushai back to Absalom so that he might give him counsel that would be to David's advantage. Ahithophel, who had been an advisor to David, had defected to Absalom. In chapter 17, these two advisors are giving Absalom contradictory counsel about whether or not to attack his father at this time. Let's read verses 1 and 2. Ahithophel said to Absalom, "I would choose 12,000 men and set out tonight in pursuit of David. I would attack him while he is weary and weak. I would strike him with terror, and then all the people with him will flee. I would strike down only the king." In other words, if David could be destroyed, the rebellion would be broken and Absalom would be made king. Ahithophel's advice, of course, would be disastrous for David if it were followed. Ahithophel outlines his plan. Verse 3. "And bring all the people back to you. The death of the man you seek will mean the return of all. All the people will be unharmed." This plan seemed good to Absalom and to all the elders of Israel. Even Absalom agreed to this heartless plan. But Absalom said, "Summon also Hushai the Archite, so we can hear what he has to say." When Hushai came to him, Absalom said, "Ahithophel has given this advice. Should we do what he says? If not, give us your opinion." It was a good thing that Hushai was present because he offers an altogether different strategy. He gives Absalom advice that is very good, but it is favorable to David. David is in a very vulnerable position and desperately needs time. Verse 7. Hushai replied to Absalom, "The advice Ahithophel has given is not good this time. You know your father and his men. They are fighters, and as fierce as a wild bear robbed of her cubs. Besides, your father is an experienced fighter. He will not spend the night with the troops. Even now he is hidden in a cave or some other place. If he should attack your troops first, whoever hears about it will say, 'There has been a slaughter among the troops who follow Absalom.' Then even the bravest soldier, whose heart is like the heart of a lion, will melt with fear. For all Israel knows that your father is a fighter, and that those with him are brave." Hushai is giving Absalom good advice, even though it is for David's benefit. His advice is simply this: you must recognize, Absalom, that you are not a man of war. Your father is. He is acquainted with the field. He is a veteran. He is rugged. He has his mighty men with him. David and his men are annoyed by what has happened. You would be very foolish to attack David now. But suppose you did attack him. David has been pursued before. He is an expert at evading capture. Saul hunted him for years, remember? David would not be among the people. He would know where to hide. He would know how to escape. Suppose you went into his host and did not find David. Soon word would circulate that you were losing the battle, and you would find that the people who had temporarily joined you in your cause would not be with you. Now that Hushai has pointed out errors in judgment in Ahithophel's counsel, he outlines a totally different strategy. Verse 11, "So I advise you, let all Israel from Dan to Beersheba, as numerous as the sand on the seashore, be gathered to you, with you yourself leading them into battle. Then we will attack him wherever he may be found, and we will fall on him as dew settles on the ground. Neither he nor any of his men will be left alive." Verse 14, Absalom and all the men of Israel said, "The advice of Hushai the Archite is better than that of Ahithophel." For the Lord had determined to frustrate the good advice of Ahithophel in order to bring disaster on Absalom. Absalom and his advisers felt that Hushai's advice was better than that of Ahithophel. From David's standpoint, God was at work in David's behalf. Let's read verses 22 and 23. "So David and all the other people with him set out and crossed the Jordan. By daybreak, no one was left who had not crossed the Jordan. When Ahithophel saw that his advice had not been followed, he saddled his donkey and set out for his house in his hometown. He put his house in order, then hanged himself. So he died and was buried in his father's tomb." Ahithophel was a proud man and a highly respected adviser. When he saw that his counsel was not followed, he considered his career over. The record says that he put his house in order, then hanged himself. Before I close, however, I'd like to comment on Ahithophel. As we saw earlier, David's sin against Ahithophel's granddaughter would have certainly enraged Ahithophel. But due to David's position, he would have been unable to set the record straight. He would have been silent. Therefore, at the opportune time, Ahithophel allies himself with Absalom and conspires to bring about David's downfall. Instead of allowing God to bring about correction, he devises his own schemes, and it comes to no avail. Revenge is not sweet, my friend, especially when it is directed to the people God has anointed. God knows everything. He knows the extent to which David had sinned. We saw this today. The ones David had insulted were the ones closest to David. If there's one person who cannot tolerate sin the most, it would be the holy God himself. So, my dear friend, it's futile to take revenge to teach somebody else a lesson. Let God take the disciplinary action. "Vengeance is mine," says the Lord. My dear friend, let God take control of your situation. If you have been used, if you have been abused, if you have been wronged, my dear friend, don't take things into your own hands. Leave it to God. You be blameless and be faithful to Him.
David's character, as demonstrated in his endurance of Shimei's wrongful cursing and his refusal to retaliate, serves as a compelling example of patient endurance under suffering. This trait aligns with Jesus' teachings, where he commands Christians to bless those who curse you and not retaliate when others attack them. And the story further illustrates that David's decision not to retaliate had practical benefits. His spies found a safe harbor in Bahurim, Shimei's hometown. David's willingness to turn the other cheek likely made a positive impression on the locals, contributing to their assistance to his spies. Ultimately, David prioritized God's judgment of his actions over the opinions of people of Bahurim, accepting that Yahweh's judgment is just. David's hope was that God might show him pity due to the cursing, balancing Shimei's cursing with a blessing. This hope aligns with Psalms, where the psalmist prays for God to look upon their affliction and distress and take away their sins in Psalm 25. Both David shared the belief that patient endurance rather than retaliation could result in God's favor, which they valued above all human assistance. David's patient endurance in the face of Shimei's cursing exemplifies the biblical principles of not retaliating against those who wrong us and trusting in God's judgment and favor. May God bless you.